Hello, welcome to the Warframe Collective. Today, we are going to be taking one of my favorite beam weapons, which is the Tenet Cycron, and we are going to be putting it up against its big brother, which is the Kuva Nukor. And I know some people probably think they already know how this test is going to go, but this is actually going to be closer than you might think. The Cycron is a corpus plasma radiation beam pistol with a battery that automatically regenerates ammo for its user the second you stop firing. The Cycron is a highly accurate weapon, and with the right build on this thing can actually deal payloads. And it functions pretty similar to the Kuva Nukor in the sense that when you shoot an enemy, you're gonna hit a couple enemies that are in close proximity to that enemy also. Whereas the Nukor is a Grineer sidearm that fires a microwave-like frequency beam that inflicts radiation damage, boasting an extreme critical multiplier, but that multiplier is heavily offset by its almost non-existent critical chance. This weapon creates and focuses a high-frequency field of microwaves, literally cooking the target from the inside. And once again, the Kuva Nukor is also a highly accurate weapon. When we look at the base stats of the Tenet Cycron, we can see that at base, the Tenet Cycron has a 12 fire rate with 40 rounds in the magazine, and it has a 0.5 reload speed that's less than a second with one punch through. It also comes equipped with 20% crit chance with a 1.8 times crit multiplier and a 40% status chance, and it has 22 base damage, which is heat. Now, on my Kuva Nukor, this thing at base has a 10 fire rate and it comes with 77 rounds in the magazine, but it comes with a 2-second reload speed and 0 punch through. The Kuva Nukor also boasts a 7% crit chance with a 5 times critical multiplier and a 50% status chance, and at base it has 21 radiation. So we're going to start with the Kuva Nukor. Not the Kuva Nukor. We're going to start with the Tenet Cycron. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to test this thing out unmodded against some level 80 enemies. And we're going to see how this thing does with its base stats without any mods on it. So as you guys can see, the Tenet Cycron is actually pretty nasty at base. And keep in mind, everybody's Tenet Cycron is going to be a little different depending on what Warframe you were using when you got your big sister. But at base, this Tenet Cycron with heat damage is actually doing pretty well. And just as the Kuva Nukor will do, this will hit additional enemies that are in close proximity to your primary target. Next, let's go ahead and put a build on this bitch. And so this is what we're gonna run, and we are running secondary deadhead because this weapon is so accurate, but you can actually swap that reflex draw out for something like a ruinous extension just to give you a little bit more range. So this is the level 80 test. Let's see how this weapon performs with a full build on it. And with the most recent damage changes we got, I believe the most optimal variant of the beam weapons is probably going to be one with the magnetic base damage. So I would advise that if you do plan on farming a Tenet Cycron, you use mag to farm it. But as you can see, this weapon is absolutely nasty, and because it's extremely accurate, we don't really have much trouble hitting our headshots. We were able to melt the normal enemies as well as the Eximus units. So the Tenet Cycron is pretty nasty. So let's go ahead and boost the level of these enemies up to 165 and see if the weapon still performs at an optimal damage rating. Spoiler alert, it fucking does. Now remember, This weapon also comes with one punch through. And because of the nature of how beam weapons work, that one punch through actually works inescapably well on the Tenet Cycron. So assuming you can line a bunch of enemies up, you'll have no problem zapping through these assholes with that one punch through. And at higher levels, the Tenet Cycron actually works really well as a primer. It's actually a very good primer, as you can pull it out, spray a group of enemies real quick, and then switch back to your primary weapon and deal massive damage. So the Tenet Cycron is actually pretty fucking nasty. Now, we actually do have a Riven for this thing. But we're not gonna worry about the Riven just yet. We're gonna switch up the build a little bit, and we're gonna do this by getting rid of Hornet Strike. And unfortunately, that's gonna bring our total damage down, but we're gonna swap Hornet Strike out with Primed Convulsion. Now, even with Primed Convulsion, that's still gonna have our base damage lower than it initially was with Hornet Strike. But stay with me here, because I know some people are gonna see this and they're gonna probably think I'm smoking some shit. But let's just see how the build performs before we jump to conclusions. So we're gonna test this out against some level 165 enemies just like before. So initially on your opening attack, it's going to be a bit slower from when you were using Hornet Strike. But once our damage ramps up from primary Deadhead and we have all of our buffs active, we're able to melt these guys in less than a second. And that doesn't just go for regular enemies, that also goes for the Eximus units. And of course, you want to be hitting your headshots in order to be hitting your optimal TTK. But for me, the most non-accurate player, that's really not even a problem because the Tenet Cycron is so accurate. And once again, remember, the Tenet Cycron also comes with one punch through. So if you can line all the enemies up, which you often can do in Warframe, you can absolutely melt this guys. And once again, because we're not running Hornet Strike, our initial base damage is a little lower, but once we get all of our buffs active from primary Deadhead, which only takes mere seconds to do, we can melt these guys like it's nobody's business. So it's all gonna be a matter of preference, whether you wanna use Hornet Strike or get rid of Hornet Strike and just go for pure status and critical chance. Now, we have spent quite a bit of time on the Tenet Cycron, and I wasn't gonna put on a Riven for the simple fact that I don't have a Riven for the Kuva Nukor. But at the end of the day, I decided, fuck it, you know? I might as well put on the Riven just because in a normal environment, you as the player are obviously going to be using everything at your disposal. So I might as well put on the Riven and show you how the weapon performs. Now with the Riven, we're currently at 142% status chance with a 3x crit multiplier. Now, that 3x crit multiplier is actually down from the 3.4 we had on the last build, but that extra bit of status chance helps so much that it really doesn't matter, because even Eximus units at 165 aren't any match for the amount of damage this thing puts out. And you might be wondering how this thing performs in a live combat environment. Well, this thing, as well as the Kuva Nukor, performs exactly the same. But next, we're going to be running everybody's favorite beam weapon, and we're going to start with no mods on this weapon just to see how it performs at base. And I was actually surprised to see that at base, the Kuva Nukor actually performs a lot worse than the Tenet Cycron. I was not expecting that. I thought at base the Kuva Nukor would probably still melt these guys, but apparently not. Now, obviously, we're not going to be using this at base, so let's go ahead and throw a build on this bitch. And once again, guys, I do not have a revving for this weapon, but this is the build that we're going to start out with. So this is the Kuva Nukor, guys. This is everybody's favorite beam weapon. And remember, this does not have any punch through. And because it doesn't have any punch through, it doesn't work as well when enemies are in a line as the Tenet Cycron did. But because of the nature of how beam weapons works, it still works well enough to hit enemies that are in close proximity to each other. And as you can see, the Kuva Nukor absolutely had no problem melting those level 80 basic enemies, and it doesn't seem to have much issue melting these Eximus units either. So the Kuva Nukor is an absolute beast, and the sad thing about the Kuva Nukor is no matter what, it will probably always overshadow the Tenet Cycron for the simple fact that this is like the go-to beam weapon for everybody. If you have something and it works, why replace what's not broken? Anyway, as you can see, at level 165, the Kuva Nukor still absolutely melts these guys. And these are just the basic enemies, but you get the same result on the level 165 Eximus units. The only thing that you might have to worry about with the Kuva Nukor is every now and then you run the possibility of running out of ammo like you saw just there. I actually ran out of ammo just there because I forgot to pick up ammo before I boosted the enemy levels, and I had to clip the video so I could basically grab some more ammo. The next thing we're gonna do with the Kuva Nukor is we're gonna make a status build just like we did with the Tenet Cycron. Now to do this, we're gonna start by swapping Hornet Strike and replacing that with Galvanized Shot. And next, we're gonna go ahead and replace Convulsion with Primed Convulsion. And that's still gonna drop our damage dramatically, but the increase in status chance should be enough to make up the difference. Now, you'll probably notice that I'm not running Secondary Deadhead. I'm running Secondary Merciless. And the reason for that is because due to the nature of how the Kuva Nukor works, I find it a lot easier to buff my damage using Secondary Merciless. So because we do not have the base damage that we initially did, our damage starts out a little slower and our time to kill isn't as optimal as it was when we're using Hornet Strike. But as we get our buffs active from Secondary Merciless, you can see we start melting these dudes within seconds. And because the buffs wear off so quickly from Secondary Merciless, you want to make sure to move on to your next target pretty quickly and melt the Eximus units. And as you can see, the Kuva Nukor with a status build is absolutely nasty. So I do believe the damage justifies the removal of Hornet Strike. So I wanted to show that one more time with Secondary Merciless active, but because Secondary Merciless wears off so quickly, it's hard to maintain stacks of Secondary Merciless. I think Secondary Merciless stacks up to 12, but it wears off within 5 seconds, whereas Secondary Deadhead does not stack up to 12, but it maintains for like 30 seconds, I believe. So that's another reason why I usually prefer Secondary Deadhead and Primary Deadhead over Secondary and Primary Merciless. And to be honest with you, bro, I should probably just stop being a bitch and put primary deadhead on this bitch anyway, and just clean up my accuracy and stop complaining. But to each his own, right? So now we're gonna test these weapons out in live combat. And as you can see, this is the still path. And the reason we are on Earth is because we are running a lot of corrosive damage on our Kuva Nukor. And because these enemies on Earth are supposed to be more susceptible to corrosive damage, I figure Earth is usually the perfect test environment. And as you can see, the Kuva Nukor is actually really nasty, although it did have a little bit of trouble eating through that tanky motherfucker right there. So one thing that has always kind of tripped me out about the Nukor in general is the Nukor is a Grineer weapon, right? Yet the Nukor is base radiation. Why the fuck would the Grineer make a base radiation pistol that emits crazy amounts of microwave damage when that's the exact type of thing they are susceptible to? It always tripped me out how this is a Grineer weapon, because it never made sense to me why they would build a weapon that will work especially well against them. Now, the funny thing is, you also see this level of contradiction in some of the Corpus weapons, because when you look at Corpus as a whole, Corpus are generally weak to electricity as well as magnetic damage. And then when you look at the Corpus weapon stockpile, they have several weapons that feature electric and magnetic damage at base, like the Lanka. So it's funny how the Corpus and Grineer, they make perfect weapons to kill other members of their faction. I find that a little bit funny. But to me, with the Corpus, it almost makes more sense, right? Because Corpus have tech weapons, right? So you would almost expect the Corpus to have a fucking beam weapon that shoots electricity, or a goddamn sniper that shoots an electric projectile. So it makes more sense with the Corpus. And I definitely think they got it right with the Cycron, because the Cycron is essentially a radiation pistol that never runs out of ammo. So they definitely got it right with this thing. Now, the Cycron is probably my favorite beam weapon as far as secondaries go. And one thing that frustrates me about the Cycron is the fact that the Cycron has been around since back in the day, but nobody gave a fuck about the Cycron until they created a Tenet version. And that's usually how it goes in Warframe. There's a bunch of weapons that people consider obscure because they're not meta, and thus they don't get used and they get overshadowed by better weapons. And one thing about Warframe is, depending on how you build something, you can make almost anything good. So I always try to make a build with almost every weapon and put at least 2 to 3 pharma on it, on the off chance that I can actually make the weapon really good, or on the off chance that in the future DE actually buffs the weapon to be very good in endgame, which they have done in the past. Take a weapon like the Cyanex, for example. The Cyanex is one of my favorite pistols because it has a gimmick that I really like. But the problem is, the pistol is fairly weak. The Cyanex shoots several homing projectiles, and because of the nature of how the pistol works, I imagine the pistol is extremely weak because DE doesn't want people just running through the game on autopilot with a weapon that has homing projectiles. But mark my words, If the Cyanex Prime ever comes out, or the Cyanex Vandal, the Cyanex will be one of the most popular weapons in the fucking game. Anyway, the Cyanex is a really fucking nasty pistol, and it's highly accurate, and you never have to worry about the ammo economy of this bitch. I honestly think you should use it, but I know it's gonna be overshadowed by its big brother ultimately. But that's still okay, because as long as you're using something you really like, that's what the game is about. Whereas you might prefer the Kuva Nukor, personally, I prefer the Tenet Cycron. So when we compare these weapons and we ask which one is stronger, the stronger weapon is probably going to be the Kuva Nukor. But this all comes down to a matter of preference for me, because personally, I will take the Tenet Cycron over the Kuva Nukor any day. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a beautiful day. Peace.